Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to our special seminar today. We're really fortunate, and it makes it worth it to have a special seminar for us, certainly, to have Vinay Prasad, who happened to be on the East Coast from the West Coast where he lives, and he agreed to come here and give a talk. So some of you, how many people here know him from Twitter? He's a big tweeter and very, very informative. So I encourage you all to follow him. But other reasons to know of him, he went to Hopkins for his MPH. He came here, walked these halls not that long ago. He's a graduate of University of Chicago School of Medicine, so you might not have known him from there. And then trained in general internal medicine at Northwestern, so sort of the Midwest. But since then, and since his MPH, he was here at Hopkins, which I didn't even know, even though we have overlapping interests, before moving to Oregon Health and Science University, where he is now. He has written a book, which I encourage you all to go to the library and read, and he's co-authored it with Dr. Adam Sifu, am I pronouncing it correctly? Called Ending Medical Reversal, Improving Outcomes, Saving Lives, and Johns Hopkins University Press. As I said, he's very active on Twitter, so you might consider following him there. But he's also the author, he's incredibly prolific, of over 125 peer-reviewed articles, and you'll see him a lot in all the big journals and what he writes about. He's an oncologist, so he also sees patients. But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you. And please thank Dr. Prasad with me.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Can you guys hear me okay? Thank you so much, Dr. Dickerson. I guess it's my honor to be invited back to speak here. The only thing I would say differently is that I would encourage you, instead of going to the library, to actually purchase the book. No, just kidding. No, don't check it out of the library. Please don't. No. So I guess I'll start. So I want to talk to you today about medical reversal, and I picked a very provocative title for a reason, because I wanted to try to get some people to come to this talk. So I'm going to try to argue that why 46% of what we do, and by we I mean medical professionals, the healthcare system, health policy people, is wrong. And in terms of financial disclosure, Dr. Dickerson was kind enough to mention this book that we wrote for Johns Hopkins University Press. And, I do like to say that, in terms of a financial disclosure, for the amount of hours it takes to write a book and the amount of money you make from writing the book, I think it makes you aspire for a minimum wage. So it's not really a big disclosure. But the real disclosure of this talk, I think, is that some of what I talked to you about today is controversial. It's not my purpose to disparage any particular medical practices, although I will do so in this talk. But the real purpose of my talk is to talk about broad patterns of medical progress, about innovation, about evidence, how that evidence is increasingly hijacked, and about some missteps in medicine. So let me start. So what is medical reversal? I think most of us think about medicine in terms of that, in medicine, new practices replace older ones, new things come along that are better than what came before. And so right here I have a picture of two Model Ts, the original Model T and the Tesla Model T. We think of medicine as a series of incremental progress, like what took us from this car to this car. And there are many examples where that is, in fact, the case, the history of medicine. We used to use H2 blockers to suppress stomach acid, and then we replaced them with proton pump inhibitors, which do a much better job of that and last much longer. We used to use combination chemotherapy in the treatment of Hodgkin's disease, which was curative with older regimens like MOP, pioneered by Vincent DeVita. We've come a little bit further to using slightly newer combination chemotherapy regimens in Hodgkin's disease, which have less toxicity. We used to reperfuse arteries in the throes of myocardial infarction with drugs like streptokinase or tissue plasminogen activator. We've come a little bit further than that by using plain old balloon angioplasty and then percutaneous coronary angioplasty and the use of stents. And you may debate whether or not this final thing, from moving from bare metal to drug-eluting, was in fact a major step or a step at all. But I think in many instances in medicine, you can think of the history of medicine was a progression from things that kind of worked to things that work a little bit better. But what is medical reversal? I want to suggest to you and try to convince you today that at many other times, something we had been doing in medicine, doing for decades that was propelled by our guidelines, was found to be no better or worse than a prior or lesser standard of care, including doing nothing. I think of seminal examples like the routine use of a Swan-Ganz catheter, which is a way to collect real-time information on patients in the ICU. Using that information to tailor therapy was something we all thought was going to benefit our patients. It turned out not to do that. The routine use of hormone therapy for postmenopausal women, which was widely advocated in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, was done to decrease the rates of heart attacks, strokes, was actually found later in a randomized trial at the WHI to increase the rates of embolic events. Routine percutaneous angioplasty, which is a terrific medical intervention for a patient suffering from ST segment or non-ST segment elevation MI, is a rather modest or perhaps even lousy intervention for patients suffering from stable angina. And yet this is the bulk of stenting in the United States of America. Even today, the bulk of stents placed are for the indication of stable angina. And that was rather resoundingly contradicted in 2007 by the COURAGE study, which showed that although patients today continue to believe this intervention decreases the rate of heart attacks and increases life expectancy, it does neither of those two things. There's still a question about whether or not it actually improves the symptoms of angina, which I hope if we have time we can talk a little bit more about, but some people are a little skeptical of that as well, including myself. Okay, so medical reversal is much more like this. This is the Volkswagen diesel. You know, you bought this car thinking you were going to pollute less, you're going to contribute less to carbon emissions, but in retrospect it was found that if you had just bought a regular car, that would have been better, you would have been better off. You know, you would have been better off at achieving your goal. So I think medical reversal is a lot like this. I think in 2011 we first defined medical reversal, but I'll give you a formal definition. We call it when a large, well-done study, typically a randomized control trial or a study with better blinding, better controls, better power, better endpoints, in other words, less bias, when such a study contradicts current medical practice. And in these cases, this study is usually so good from an evidence point of view that it contradicts the entire totality of the evidence that came before it, which is often non-randomized, case report, observational, retrospective, historical controlled studies, studies of lower reliability. And we wrote about it with John Ioannidis, who many of you all know, who's at Stanford, and we published a letter about it in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2011. But I want to say that, you know, when I talk about medical reversal, it's very similar to other concepts in medicine, other concepts that you hear discussed a lot now, such as no value or low value care, de-adopted or failed medical practices, contradicted or refuted practices, or even slow medicine. And I think Adam Elshog and colleagues from Australia made a word cloud of words used in this space to describe low-value practices, and reversal's in there, but by no means is it the dominant sort of language we use. We're all kind of getting at the same concepts, I think. So in this talk, I'm going to give you some examples of reversal that kind of span what I hope is sort of all walks of medicine. I'm going to give you some estimates, empirical estimates of the frequency with which this happens. I'm going to try to take you through some of the harms of this practice, some of the origins. Why does this even happen? What are some solutions? What are some objections? And what might evidence-based medicine look like going forward? So some select examples of reversal. I guess so. A few months ago, I was asked to present to a group of pediatricians, and I'm not a pediatrician. They asked me, so can you swap out some of your examples and put some pediatric examples in there? And I ended up doing that. And one of those examples I thought was really so compelling that I just kept it in there. And so that's my first example today. The use of tympanostomy for otitis media. So some of you may know that children often suffer from recurrent middle ear infections. And when they're very, very young and they suffer from recurrent ear infections, I think doctors, they worry about whether or not they're able to hear and they're able not to have cognitive development on par with children who don't suffer from middle ear infections. And so it actually turned out to be that there's a way you can intervene on these children. You can place a hollow tympanostomy tube across the tympanic membrane in the ear, causing drainage of the fluid, which would presumably improve their hearing. And this actually became the second most common procedure, medical surgery done for children after circumcision. So it was incredibly widely done. And it was widely believed that doing this was necessary to preserve cognitive functioning in the developing mind. Then what happened was a really well-done study that started out in the 1990s that randomized children who had recurrent otitis media to the intervention, early tympanostomy placement or delayed treatment, where it would only be done if it kept persisting or if there were some issues down the road. So I think this is a very good medical study of a practice. Is it good policy to routinely place these tubes? And that was what we were doing at the time. And what they did was they've actually been able to publish 4 New England Journal papers from this study with developmental outcomes at 1 year, at 6 months, at 1 year, at 3 years, at 9 years. And at every time point they've published those studies, they have shown there's absolutely no difference between the two groups in any measure of cognitive function, developmental progress. So I think it's sobering to actually think that, many children, second most common procedure, was being done all the time, and it's really no better than if you had just waited a little bit and did it in very select kids who really needed it. Here's another example, stenting for renal artery stenosis. I think those of us who treat patients with hypertension know that atherosclerotic disease, high blood pressure, and age kind of go hand in hand. They're often found together in the elderly. We all know that there's a group of patients out there for whom you put on a blood pressure medicine, and it seems like no matter what you do, you can't get their blood pressure under control. And in that group of people, some of them have something called a narrowing of the renal artery. And you may need to know that the renal artery supplies blood to the kidney, and if the kidney detects not getting enough blood, it will secrete hormones that will raise blood pressure, hormones like renin. And so it was believed that in a group of people who have, narrowed artery leading to the kidney and refractory hypertension, that really the culprit is that artery. And if you go in there and you open up that artery, you're going to improve blood flow to the kidney, you're going to decrease renin, you're going to decrease angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2, you're going to lower the blood pressure. And so it's widely done to stent the renal artery for those patients. And by 2016, we have 3 randomized controlled trials of this practice. Those trials range in size from a few hundred to about, the largest is a 900-person randomized trial. And in every one of those randomized trials, the authors find the same thing, that although this is a very plausible intervention and it should work, it in fact does not work. Randomized trials show there's no difference in time to renal events, time to cardiovascular events, and that's been shown in a couple of studies. And the reduction in the amount of blood pressure medications you have to take by doing this procedure is very marginal. I think it's something on the order of 3 to 2 or 3 to 2.3. So this is a costly medical practice. It costs annually Medicare $1 billion a year. It's widely done. It's still done even after these negative studies. Proponents say that there is a group of people who really do benefit from this intervention. They're the sickest people, the people who have flash flood pulmonary edema, really bad, strangulated renal arteries. And what I would say to the proponents is that that's plausible. I mean, no one can ever say an intervention cannot work in a different population. But shouldn't the burden be on the proponents at some point in the history of this intervention to demonstrate it can improve outcomes in any group of people in a randomized study? They have shifted the burden on to critics to show it doesn't work in all situations. And that is, unfalsifiable and not scientific. I'll give you another example from cholesterol. Niacin and fenofibrate. These are blockbuster cholesterol medicines. They improve HDL, lower triglycerides, lower LDL. These were widely extolled for decades to patients who were either on a statin or couldn't take a statin. And patients were told that you had high cholesterol. If you take one of these medicines instead, we're going to lower your rate of heart attacks, of strokes. We're going to help you out. You should persist with these medicines even though they're very often intolerable. I think for those of us who've given niacin, we've all had patients come in complaining of the flushing, the symptoms that come with taking niacin. It's not an easy medicine to take. So we've extolled patients to do this. These drugs were $1 billion a year drugs. And then finally, in the last 3 to 5 years, we've had 2 randomized trials that study what is their effect not on the surrogate measure, cholesterol, but on the hard outcome, cardiovascular events. And what we find is that the addition of niacin to a statin failed to improve outcomes in AIM-HIGH, and the addition of fenofibrate against a placebo after a statin failed to improve outcomes in the ACCORD study. And the FDA last year revoked the indication of these drugs after, almost 2 decades on the market for this purpose. These were widely used cholesterol medicines that failed. And I think it's important to consider this as we have a whole new era of cholesterol medicines that we really don't have this outcome data for, like the PCSK9 inhibitors. The last example I'll give you is steroid injection for spinal stenosis. I think some of you may remember a few years ago, there was an outbreak of fungal meningitis in compounding pharmacies for patients who were being injected with steroids for refractory back pain caused from spinal stenosis. And many people said that the problem there was a problem with compounding pharmacies. They're not adhering to standards of cleanliness. And that, of course, that's a problem. But the real problem was, does the intervention actually work? And in a randomized controlled trial comparing the addition of a glucocorticoid to just lidocaine, and I should tell you one thing, lidocaine has a very short half-life, so when you inject lidocaine for spinal stenosis, there will be no effect after 36 hours. There'll be no effect after 48 hours. It will be gone. So this study is a study of comparing lidocaine plus or lidocaine plus a glucocorticoid or steroid. At 3 weeks and 6 weeks, if the glucocorticoid has any effect, there will be a difference in pain scores or function scores on some scale. And in fact, this study found that there was no such difference, telling us that the addition of the steroid to lidocaine had no benefit. And actually, probably the entire procedure is an elegant sham procedure. We haven't shown that much yet, but I suspect it's very similar to other things I'll show you. So the failure in the compounding pharmacy case, I think, is that we were doing something for decades that didn't need to be done. And then when there was a bad event, we harmed a lot of people. Okay, so those are some examples of reversal. And now I'm going to try to put it in context and say, can I quantify how often this happens? So this is a project that was run by, I think Fee Godley started running this, BMJ Clinical Evidence, about a decade ago. And what the authors here did at the British Medical Journal were, they looked through 3,000 medical practices that doctors were doing day in, day out. And they wanted to assess that if you took this set of everything doctors are doing and you went to PubMed and you looked them all up, what does the state of the evidence look like? And here's what they found. 11% were clearly beneficial with randomized controlled trials or meta-analysis extolling that benefit. 24% were probably likely to be beneficial. Randomized trials had, strong suggestion of benefit. For some group of these studies, there was a trade-off between benefits and harms. And for some, they were either likely to be ineffective or harmful or unlikely to be beneficial, truly harmful things that we were continuing to do. But for 50% of the things that was happening day in, day out in the doctor's office, there was in fact no evidence. Either way, do they help or do they hurt? And I believe that this is probably the sad state of evidence, of medicine today, that most of what we're doing is in fact not evidence-based, but eminence-based. It was, we do it because someone very senior to us told us that's the right thing to do. And here's why it's the right thing to do. They tell a very, kitschy story, a story that you like to repeat to your trainees. And so I think, this is the sobering reality. But my question was, and the question Adam and I had when we looked at this was, what happens if you really held this 50% to rigorous empirical scrutiny? What would happen? So we did this paper in the Mayo Clinic proceedings in 2013, and we were very fortunate because it got picked up by the New York Times, so it generated a lot of interest. And we tried to analyze, can we estimate what percent of current medical practice is in fact demonstrably false? And I will say at the outset, actually, before I get into this, there is no perfect way to do this study. I mean, the real perfect way would be, for the federal government to give, $100 billion to a separate agency who will actually prioritize and rank clinical questions and conduct pivotal trials, and you start to answer some questions. But in lieu of that, what's the best way we can approximate this? And so we tried one way to approximate it. And so here was our way to approximate it. We took every original article that appeared in one medical journal, the New England Journal of Medicine, which currently and then and now still has the highest impact factor in our field. We took every article that appeared in a decade, and 2 people read every article. So there were 2,044 original articles that appeared in a decade of the New England Journal. And 1,300 concerned a medical practice. So what do I mean by that? The remainder of these articles did not have anything to do with anything doctors did. They had to do with the molecular science of medicine, like MIDI88 is a causative mutation of Waldenstrom macroglobulinemia. They were the kind of papers you'd read in Nature or Science or Cell. But these papers, these concerned a medical practice, what doctors were doing, stenting or some policy measure, Medicaid expansion, something like that. So the first thing we found is that the majority, almost 1,000 or 73%, tested something novel. That if you were in the New England Journal of Medicine, the majority of those papers were like, I have a new anticoagulant, I have a new cancer drug. And if you tested something novel, 77% of the time, what was novel was beneficial. It was better than what came before. And this is, in fact, I think, evidence of selective reporting bias, which is that if the New England Journal of Medicine is going to publish something new, you better have done something, impressive. Okay, but this is not what we were interested in. We were interested in the reverse. We found 363 medical practices that were testing something doctors were already doing, about a quarter of our data set. And if you tested something we were already doing, 38% of the time you found that what we were already doing was in fact beneficial, but 40% of the time you found that what we were doing was no better or worse than a prior or lesser standard of care, or what we call medical reversal. So I think our provocative conclusion was that if you were to subject established medical practice to rigorous testing, you would find that perhaps some of it is validated and some of it, perhaps even as high as 40%, is contradicted. And in the appendix of the paper, we detail every single one of these reversals, and we actually did it in the book as well. And we argue, one, how did this come to be a medical practice? Two, is there proof people were doing it? And three, why is this data so good it contradicts the whole practice? And if you look at this list of reversals, you will see it includes everything: medications, procedures, devices, surgeries, screening tests, over-the-counter medications, vitamins, supplements, treatment algorithms. By that I mean, for people who had a heart attack, we would routinely send this test, a P2Y12 level or a platelet reactivity assay. If the test was high, we would change the medicine. If it was low, we would keep them on the medicine. This entire algorithm, that strategy, was tested in a randomized trial, and it was found not to work. Didn't improve outcomes for patients, led to a lot of medication switching, but that led to nothing. Just led to, increased cost from those newer medicines. Diagnostic instruments that gave us information, systems interventions, the things that Atul Gawande is famous for, quality and performance measures. In short, every corner of healthcare was contradicted. In every part of medicine, something we were doing was found to be wanting. And so, this is a little bit of an oversimplification, but I think there's some truth in this. If you combine the BMJ's data, looking at medical practices, what you find, and estimates from our work for what about the thing that we don't have enough evidence for, I think you will find that the final state of medical practice is something like this. Maybe half of what we do actually works. Maybe a big chunk is truly inconclusive or works, in some groups but not others. But probably 35% of what we do is just frankly ineffective. And the title of my talk was I was going to convince you 46% of what we do doesn't work. But maybe there's truth of something in between. A third to half of what we do doesn't work. I think that's very high. I mean, even if that percentage were as low as 5%, I think there would be reasons to change the current system. I like to give the analogy of, earthquakes, they're rare in California, but they have building code that is to withstand earthquakes, even though they're a very infrequent event. We're having something that's an event, that's a bad event at a much higher frequency. Shouldn't we have a new building code to kind of deal with this? Okay, so why is this harmful? All right, the harms of this are threefold. All of the people who underwent a practice that didn't work in the years it fell in favor, they were harmed. They suffered either, one, the harms of the procedure; two, they didn't get the benefits; three, they lost their time or their money, and opportunity cost of having one thing done when there may have been another thing that worked. Two, people who undergo the practice in the lag time before it falls out of favor. I'm going to show you data that medicine is like a battleship. We don't turn on a dime. When practices are contradicted, we continue to do it for maybe even 10 years before we stop doing it. Those 10 years, more and more people are harmed by the flawed practice. Finally, loss of trust in the medical system. I think I'll talk about this in a second, but there have been some examples where this phenomenon leads to widespread loss of trust in the medical system. And people who move into that space are people who, don't believe vaccines work, or don't believe any science is right, or don't believe any medical treatment works. And you don't want the limits of medicine to lead to a rejection of medicine. You want it to lead to a fixing of medicine. All right, so I think it's very clear. If you underwent the practice during the years it fell in favor, you were harmed. Two, the lag time phenomenon. We saw in the wake of the Courage trial a reduction in stenting for stable coronary artery disease. But yet the rates are still very, very high. It hasn't led to a full resolution. Patients who undergo stenting for stable angina, in recent studies in the BMJ and JAMA Internal Medicine, they state in very high percentages that they believe the intervention will decrease the rates of MIs and improve survival. And those two things are just patently false. And yet they believe it when they're undergoing. So there's clear misinformation here. And, arguably, if the patient has such a flawed idea of what the purpose of the practice is, it's arguably an unethical practice. This was a paper John did in 2007 in JAMA where he tried to argue how long or contradicted claims persist in the literature before they fall out of favor. And he picked one claim, which was a claim that beta-carotene could decrease the rate of lung cancer. And that was a claim that rose to prominence in 1981 based on an observational study. And that claim rose to prominence, and this is a map of this number of citations to that claim over time, the solid line. So this was the paper published. The next year was highly cited. Then we should know by 1993, 3 randomized trials had been completed that showed from 91 to 93 that showed beta-carotene did not decrease the rate of lung cancer. One of those studies showed it increased the rate of lung cancer. 2 were null. So by 93, we knew supplementation with beta-carotene was a bad idea. But John shows that citations to that paper remained elevated for about 7 years afterwards before falling down. And his control here is this dotted line, which is the average citation decay for a paper in that journal in that year. So this is what the average citations look like in that journal, and this is this paper. And then John looked at these citations and he asked, are these papers that say, hey, look, beta-carotene, a great story of why you need randomized trials and why you got it wrong? No, they looked at it to say, beta-carotene, still highly promising for lung cancer prevention. Okay, I'm going to skip this. But I'm going to skip the explaining this graph, but I'm going to mention loss of trust in one thing. We've seen, I think, over and over as the PSA guidelines have shifted, as mammography guidelines have shifted, that when you tell the public that something we had been extolling them to do for a long period of time is actually probably not in their best interest to do, people do not believe the reason behind that is a genuine reason. People look for alternative reasons. You're just trying to save money. This is a form of death panel. This is a form of rationing. I think and because of that, they come to distrust recommendations doctors make. And I think that's a very hard to measure, but devastating harm from this. So where does this come from? Okay, so this is my one busy slide. But I will say that I think this captures why do we get medical practices wrong? So one thing I'll say is that even if we did the perfect studies, there will be some rate of reversal because statistical science is a probabilistic science. There will be some rate, but the rate of reversal we tolerate right now is orders of magnitude higher than the mere uncertainty of statistics. And here's why reversal happens. We adopted something based on inadequate or biased studies without definitive trials ongoing or forthcoming. So this will tie into accelerated approval. We adopted something without good enough reason that it should work. And that's either based on pathophysiology alone, pathophysiology plus anecdotal evidence, epidemiological evidence with residual confounding, of which nutritional epidemiology sadly is riddled with, historically controlled evidence, even randomized trials. We've adopted evidence based on randomized trials, but those randomized trials were wanting. These were the ways they were wanting. Inappropriate controls. Patients were too young or non-representative. Inappropriate dosing, inappropriate comparators, inappropriate prohibitions against concomitant medications, or they're done in a single center with an unusually enthusiastic proponent. These collectively, I think, are called pragmatic. The more you make these look like the real world, you have a pragmatic trial, which is in fact the only form of really real world drug evidence that I really trust. We can debate that a little, but at least trust for efficacy. We can debate about harms. I think for harms, you can get a world of data from observational studies. But randomized trials are flawed in other ways that are beyond the pragmatic thing. Drug run-in periods, where all the patients who are enrolled in a study take the study drug or placebo, we weed out people, and then we randomize them. That leads to irreproducible inclusion criteria, magnitudes of benefit that are likely overestimated. Inappropriate endpoints, the emphasis on surrogate endpoints and not clinical endpoints. Early termination of trials, which Victor Montori has nicely shown that exaggerates treatment benefits. Selective reporting or publication bias. These are all ways in which randomized trials can be misleading. And meta-analysis, I think, can be, obviously an incredibly powerful tool, but it is only limited by the caliber of the included studies and the completeness of the analysis. So even today, we still make treatment recommendations based on non-randomized data, and we're extolled to do so. So this was a paper we did with John and Adam and I, and Jill Jorgensen, who was a student at Northwestern at the time. And we looked at the 4 highest impact factor medical journals. We pulled out all the articles, 631 articles in 1 year. We pulled out the 300 articles that were non-randomized, not randomized studies, and we asked how many of these articles in the discussion section do the authors explicitly state that my paper should lead you to change your behavior? And that answer was 56%. They recommended a medical practice. And only 14% of those people said, hey, before you switch your behavior, we should really do a randomized trial. 86% did not. So I think this is the creme de la creme of medical journals, the journals where those of us who've published in these journals know the editors are not going to let you get away with saying things that are really unsupported. They're very strict about that in these journals. And yet, even in these journals, authors are making recommendations. If you go to the lower tier journals, I'm afraid of what you'll see. You can read them and you can see people make all sorts of claims. This is a study about epidemiology and observational epidemiology and some of the uncertainty in it, done by John and Chirag Patel, who's at Harvard now, called A Vibration of Effects. And I will just briefly make one point, which is that we all know in this room probably that when you do regression analysis, you can pick and choose the covariates you include in your model. We see papers where they include 3 to 6 to 10 to 20 covariates, such as age, race, smoking status. What John and Chirag Patel looked at was the NHANES data set, which has something like 200 different covariates. And they asked one question, which is, what if you took an exposure and linked it to overall mortality? Vitamin E, overall mortality. Vitamin D, overall mortality. And then he said, every time you do that, you can do an analysis with some covariates, 3 covariates, or you can do an analysis with 30 covariates. And, authors always give an explanation of why they chose the covariates they chose. But they asked, what if you did it with every covariate? Not just every single covariate, every combination of covariates, millions of covariate combinations. And then what if you plotted on a 2x2 on a simple graph, the hazard ratio you generate and the significance level? And what they show in this paper quite elegantly is that simply by picking and choosing covariate choices, you can get vitamin E to have a statistically significant positive association with mortality or statistically significant negative association with mortality. That the effect vibrates over that level of covariate choice. And every time you read a paper in the literature, you read 1 or 3 data points. This is a cloud of all the possible associations in that data set. And they call it the vibration of effects. And now, there's talk of, we would like to do this there's a big debate in randomized data of whether or not you should adjust for covariates. And it would be interesting to do a similar analysis for that. Because one of the worries is when you're allowed covariate adjustment in randomized trials, how are you controlling the multiplicity? You should pre-specify. But in this case, how is multiplicity controlled? Investigators may control their own multiplicity. The field is not controlling its multiplicity because NHANES was being studied at Harvard, at Hopkins, at Oregon, and in Miami, and people are publishing from all over. So field-wise multiplicity is not controlled very well. We use a lot of advanced statistical testing for handling observational data to make reliable causal conclusions. One is the propensity score. One of the ways in which you can compare observational data and randomized data is to do something called a concordance analysis, where you take the questions for which there are both randomized trials and observational studies. And in 2000, John Concato in the New England Journal and John and JAMA, they did some concordance studies, and they showed that the bigger you looked at clinical questions where there were both kinds of studies, that there was some rate of discordance, maybe 16%, maybe 20%. In other words, observational studies weren't always wrong, but they were sometimes wrong, and we didn't know when they were wrong. So that was the problem. People thought that modern techniques like propensity score adjustment would lead to more reliable causal conclusions. But in 2012, I believe this is David Kent and colleagues from JAMA, they looked at comparisons where they're both propensity score match studies and randomized studies on the same clinical question. And what they show is actually, if you could get the original figure up, you'd see the discordance is actually quite similar to what it was a decade before. And the ones that are worrisome are the ones in the upper left and the bottom right, where one study says it's a benefit, the other says it's a harm. And anything that falls outside the dotted lines, there's a difference in the point estimate. So I wonder, are propensity score match studies better? I don't think we know. I think these studies are all flawed because these are limited to the questions for which we really have both types of study design, which is a very, very select group of questions. For many questions, we only have one type or the other.
How did they control for the fact that people who enroll in RCTs, even though they're trying to answer the same clinical questions, people who enroll in RCTs might be very different from people who enroll in an observational study?
Yeah, so they did into that, but I will tell you, I'll talk about that towards the end. I have a whole section on, I think it's very clear, at least in my field, oncology. People who enroll in randomized studies, they're 10 years younger than the average cancer patient. They have fewer comorbidities. Many, many studies have shown that if you took 100 consecutive patients in lung cancer and you asked what percent would be eligible for the lung cancer studies that inform their treatment decisions, the answer is like 15%, 20%. Very, very low. So I think this point is an excellent point, which is that our randomized studies are telling us information about ideal people who may or may not exist. They're very, very select people. Those conclusions may not be extrapolatable to the rest of, you can't extrapolate it to other people. The question is, how do you get around that? And I actually think there's a big role for propensity score match studies to get around that, to give us some hypotheses to get around it. I have one great example where I'll show you a propensity score match study that undermined a randomized claim. But I think there's another way that we haven't approached as much, which is the role of pragmatic trials, which is that when drugs are approved, maybe we should remove those exclusion criteria and actually do the randomized study in the group of people that look like the people who come in our clinic. So I think that's it's an excellent question. We can talk a little more about it. Before and after studies. I think you all know that there's some fields of medicine where the bulk of what we do was I gave a treatment to 20 people, and those 20 people did better than 20 people from 10 years ago. Therefore, do this treatment. That's the bulk of cancer medicine for most diseases. Henry Sachs and Tom Chalmers showed as early as 82 that 77% of historically controlled studies found benefit, and in subsequent randomized trials on the same questions, only 20% found benefit. That there is a huge secular trend towards improved outcomes, and you can pick your patients very carefully to get very nice phase 2 data. Okay, so I'm going to take you through this figure. And I want to come back. I want to come to that question because I think that's a really good question. Dr. Dickerson and I think, are big proponents of data sharing. In fact, in 2016, it's unconscionable that the majority of clinical trial data is not accessible to a broad group of investigators to analyze, reanalyze the primary endpoint, analyze other questions that may be of interest. I think that there's opposition, strong opposition from people against data sharing, mostly people who are benefiting from the current policies of data hoarding, like trial investigators and venerable journals. I think most of the concerns about data sharing are completely overblown. They were like the concerns that we had 15 years ago. Some of you may remember people said, if you had a Wikipedia model for an encyclopedia, it will be full of rampant falsehoods because you can't let people edit it. You need experts to edit to edit what's known. And now we know that actually many empirical studies show the reliability of Wikipedia is better than or on par with other journals. The scope of it is, 10 times the size of any journal. It's been a tremendous success. So I suspect the fears for data sharing will be a lot similar to the fears for Wikipedia. But anyway, data sharing gets at some of the problems we have with clinical trials, which is that, if you think about how a clinical question is developed to all the way to publication, this is the model. We pick a clinical question, we design and conduct a trial, we have clinical trial data, we publish it. And there's bias all along the path. There's bias in the choice of the clinical question. Why are you picking that question, not another question? Are you testing a trivial hypothesis or claim? There's bias in the choice of controls, blinding, endpoints, inclusion, exclusion criteria. Why are you picking those people? As the gentleman was pointing out, those people don't look like the real world. Why are you excluding people who have heart disease? You're going to give this drug to people with heart disease once it gets on the market. Then there's bias in the coding of adverse events, bias in measurement and coding of outcomes. There's bias in the decision and timing of reported data, of endpoints emphasized, of changes to pre-planned statistical analysis and spin. This is a paper called Hardwired Bias we published in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings. And what we argue here is that data sharing is really good for these biases on the second half of the figure. We can recode from clinical study reports, although it's very tedious, we can do it. We can reanalyze unreported data, and that's been shown, to really transform impressions with Tamiflu, with Paroxetine 329. We can emphasize the more important endpoints, but all the bias that happens in the first half of this figure, we cannot control for, even if we had all the data. We can't choose the inclusion criteria. We can't ask a different question that was asked. And I call this hardwired bias. And I think the solution to hardwired bias is to actually remove conflicted people from the design and conduct of clinical trials. I'll talk a little bit about surrogate endpoints. I think we all know by now that surrogate endpoints have misled us in clinical medicine. Lower A1C isn't better, cholesterol level is not better. I'll skip the hospitalization, but I think it's a fun thing to read about in the future. It's a paper by Hempkins and colleagues in Canadian Medical Journal. But I always talk about this surrogate because I think it's very provocative. This is a surrogate that no one would have thought of as a surrogate, that we all would have taken for granted, even myself. This was a trial of intensive diet and exercise management in patients with type 2 diabetes. It was called Look Ahead. It was about a $150 million NHLBI study. They randomized thousands of patients with type 2 diabetes who were overweight to a diet and exercise program versus not having it. And people said it was a waste of money. If you're going to diet and exercise when you have type 2 diabetes and you're overweight, you're going to have a benefit. There's no question about it. And in fact, the study showed a dramatic reduction in weight and a big increase in physical fitness, a huge decrease in waist circumference, a decrease in glycosylated hemoglobin. I mean, all of these outcomes are glowingly positive. It was maintained for 7 years in thousands of people. $100 million question. But the primary endpoint was a composite of cardiovascular events and death. And the trial was halted after, 12 or 13 years for futility because there was absolutely no difference in the primary endpoint. So the reason I show this is that this is diet and exercise, something that we all believe in. And this study asked more than the surrogate question. They asked, does it translate to clinical benefit? And they found no benefit, no signal at all. Now, what does this mean? Does it mean diet and exercise are hopeless? Well, it's similar to that renal artery stenting example. It doesn't mean that it doesn't work in all people. I don't know that. But it does mean that as it was tested and as it was conducted in these group of patients, it doesn't work as you thought it worked. And I think that is very informative. It sets the stage for what kind of trials should we be doing in the future. Do we have to go after type 2 diabetics who are much younger? Do they have to be even more overweight? Is there a different type of diet and exercise program? Are there other things we should be doing? But I think we should hold diet and exercise to the same scrutiny we hold, a novel drug in diabetes. Okay, surrogate endpoints in my field of oncology, they're going through the roof. This is a paper by Chris Booth and colleagues from Kingston, Ontario. They showed that from randomized trials from 95 to 2004, 50% had the primary endpoint of overall survival. By 2005 to 2009, it was 36% had overall survival. Instead, the primary endpoint of these studies is response rate, which is a measure of tumor shrinkage on a CT scan, which has a huge measurement error component, and time to event, which is time to progression, which is time until your cancer grows past an arbitrary threshold of tumor measurements on a CT scan. And this figure here shows that as the sample size, this is another thing. The industry support for cancer trials has grown exponentially over the last, not exponentially, linearly, as this figure shows, linearly over the last few years. But we currently have, 90% of clinical trials supported by the pharmaceutical industry in oncology. And this figure shows that as the rise of industry support in oncology trials, the sample size of oncology randomized trials has increased. Now, you may say, that's a good thing. Bigger sample sizes means more reliable point estimates, narrower confidence intervals. We know, more accurately what these drugs do. But I would say that in oncology, you can actually overpower a clinical trial. You can make a trial so big that you can detect statistically significant 3-week differences in overall survival on the order of like 6 months for 6 months and 3 weeks, 8 months and 2 weeks. Is that meaningful? Do we really want drugs that improve survival from 8 months to 8 months, 2 weeks? I don't think we do. I think we want drugs that improve survival a whole lot more. So I think there's a phenomenon in oncology of overpowered randomized controlled trials detecting clinically meaningless but statistically significant benefits. And we have drugs approved like this. Erlotinib, pancreatic cancer, median improvement in overall survival is 10 to 14 days. That's a drug approval by the US FDA. This was a paper that we published in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2015, where we asked, what is the relationship between those surrogates in oncology and the clinical outcomes of overall survival? And here's what we found. So I guess the first thing, I cut out some slides. The first thing that you know is in a surrogate validation study, what do? You really do a meta-analysis. Let's say I wanted to look at breast cancer and I want to know, does tumor shrinking in breast cancer correlate with living longer in metastatic breast cancer? How would I do that? Well, I would look up every single randomized control trial of breast cancer, metastatic breast cancer that's ever been done. I would take in both arms all the average tumor shrinking and I would plot that against the difference in overall survival across all of these studies. And that's called trial level validation. And what we looked at was what's the trial level validation in every single tumor type for every single endpoint you can think of. And we did an umbrella analysis of all the meta-analysis, and this is what we found. I've scored this as low, medium, or high based on R-squareds of 0.49 is considered low. Medium, I think, is R-squared less than 0.65, and high is an R-squared of like 0.7. And as you know, the coefficient of determination tells you the percent of variability that the surrogate explains of survival. And I didn't invent those cutoffs. Those cutoffs were invented by the German group on quality. And what we did was we scored all of the surrogates we have in oncology, and what we found was the majority were in the metastatic setting, so where cancer is already spread from where it started, and the majority of those correlations were very poor or medium. And the German group feels that poor or medium is insufficient for regulatory decision-making, only high is. In the adjuvant setting, they were actually surprisingly high. Now, what is adjuvant setting? Adjuvant means we've cut out all the cancer, there's no cancer detectable on a PET scan, and the surrogate endpoint is a recurrence of the cancer. So if you have a drug that prevents recurrence, it's likely to improve survival, although that's only true in 2 of the 3 malignancies, some malignancies more than others. That kind of makes some intuitive sense because these are cytotoxic drugs. What you're doing is you're eradicating micrometastatic disease. In the metastatic setting, drugs that merely shrink cancer or delay progression don't always improve survival. And there's a lot more data that shows that. And yet 2/3 of drugs approved by the FDA are based on shrinking tumors or delaying progression. Only 1/3 are based on overall survival. Chul Kim and I looked at if you were approved based on shrinking cancer or delaying progression, what was the impact on overall survival 5 years after you've been on the market? Are there subsequent studies or studies in the same malignancy or a different, different setting in the same malignancy? So if you were approved in the second line, what did the drug do in the front line? And what we found was these were the final results. I'll just look at all the surrogate approvals. About 15 to 20% later showed overall survival benefits. The rest, either they had clinical studies done that didn't show a survival benefit, or the survival benefit remained unknown. The majority of cancer drugs on the market that don't improve overall survival when they're approved, still we don't know if they improve overall survival 5 years later. These are incredibly costly, $100,000 cancer drugs. They're very often not often, they're all very toxic. There's a rare exception, one that's not toxic. So we're asking patients to take toxic drugs that cost a fortune, and we cannot tell them whether or not that they improve their survival. And actually, Diane Zuckerman she just published the follow-up to this paper where they showed that actually, even quality of life, we cannot tell them because that's rarely been done or is often negative. Okay, so I want to tell you a little bit about hardwired bias, and then I want to save some time for questions. Representativeness of patients. Some of the ways in which bias is incorporated in randomized trials that we really can't fix even with data sharing. So here's a good example, Paradigm HF. Some of you may know that I got in a big fight with Milk Packard for an ACE inhibitor and ARB. And we're going to randomize them to an ACE inhibitor, enalapril, at 20 milligrams a day, which is actually the FDA, 50% of the maximal FDA dosing. Or we're going to randomize them to valsartan at the maximally approved FDA dose plus the novel drug. So here's a trial of an older drug at a half dose, a novel drug, or a drug that we know works at a max dose plus another drug. And they're trying to get the other drug approved. So you can tell this is the worst trial design I've ever heard. Why don't you just give both groups the max dose ARB and the only difference is you add the new drug? Keep it clean. The only variable should be the addition of the new drug. But then they said, that's not enough to really tilt this scale the way I like to tilt it. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take 10,000 people and we're going to make them all take enalapril for 15 days. And if you take enalapril and you have some side effect you can't tolerate, we'll throw you off the study. 1,100 discontinued the study. Then we're going to put you on LCZ 696, which is the combo of valsartan and the neprilysin inhibitor sacubitril. And we're going to have you take it for 29 days. We're going to make this twice as long, really weed out some people. And then we weed out another 900 people who can't take this drug. So now we go from 10,000 to 8,000 people. 20% of the population has already been knocked out of this study. And these people, we will randomize you to either go back to enalapril or stay on the drug you're on. So what is this study design? It's a design of, for people who've taken one, then the other, and haven't discontinued, is it better to go back to the original or to stay with what you're on? It's a discontinuation design, really. And what they found was there's benefits in terms of, overall mortality and, et cetera, et cetera. But I said, what is this even telling us? If a patient comes into my office, they're up here. My question is, should I stop the medicine they're on and switch them to this novel drug? And the novel drug costs, thousands of dollars compared to the older drugs, which are pennies on the dollar. Is it better to switch them? This tests something totally different. If I had all the data from this trial, I can't answer the question of what would happen if I just randomized these people to stay with whatever they're on or take this new drug. So I think it's a very messy trial design. And then Milk Packard likes to say that the p-value in this study was so significant, it's the equivalent of 4 randomized trials. But that's not the case, right? Because the p-value is not telling you the p-value is not the measure of the false positive rate of your study's conclusion, which is that this novel drug adds something. What's the false positive rate of that? I don't think we can quantify it. It's probably very high. Okay, so now I'll say this. I think sham controls are needed for not objective endpoints, but for subjective endpoints. In the history of medicine, there have been many, many things we did that we thought made people feel better. But when you study it against an intervention that is a sham intervention, they all fell apart. Meniscectomy for knee osteoarthritis, debridement for knee osteoarthritis, RV pacing for hokum to some degree, vertebroplasty, although there's a recent study we could talk about, which I want to know how well the sham was, lumbar steroid injections. And this, I come back to the PCI for stable angina. People point out that in the COURAGE study, which was a randomized trial of medical management and then stenting only if you had persistent symptoms versus upfront stenting, there was no difference in MIs or survival, but there was a slight improvement in quality of life, although it vanished by 18 months or 24 months. And they said, well, quality of life is still a reason to stent. But I always pointed out that the control arm of that study, they didn't get a sham stenting, they just got medical management. If you had done a sham stenting, they may have had a quality of life benefit as well. And how do I know that? Well, one, there was once upon a time an intervention called the ligation of the internal mammary artery, and people thought that had a huge quality of life benefit. But then in 1953 or 56, Cobb studied in the New England Journal of Medicine sham open heart surgery versus the actual procedure, and both groups had a huge quality of life benefit. Angina is particularly susceptible to the placebo response. So we don't know that stenting for stable coronary angina actually decreases symptoms because we haven't done, I think, a sham-controlled study. And I've seen doctors consent patients for this procedure or talk to them afterwards. Sometimes we even show them their cath, and they see the blood, strangulated at a spot, and they say, look how we went in here and we opened it wide up. Now look at your heart. I was like, you tell me you have heart pain again. Tell me you have chest pain. I'd like to see you tell me that. So we really do, sham them, I think. How much of that is a placebo effect? Well, I'll skip the acupuncture. Okay, so media coverage. So the media does us no service. I think there's a great website called Health News Reviews by Gary Schweitzer, where they take all these healthcare stories and they say all the ways in which they didn't tell you about cost, they didn't tell you about this is observational design, it's not reliable for causal conclusions. There's all these, sort of things that they fault. But we wanted to look at the choice of stories the media covers. So we looked at 75 high-impact medical journals and 75 journal articles in high-impact medical journals that appeared over a 3-month period of time, and 75 newspaper articles about journal articles that appeared over the same period of time. And we asked, what percent of these studies are randomized? What percent are case control? What percent are observational? And what we found was the newspapers, they have a choice. They could pick, whatever studies they wanted to choose, but here's what they did. There were 40% of journal articles that were randomized, but the newspapers only covered 17% of them. 51% of the journal articles were observational, but they covered 70% of them. So I think the newspapers, they pick, articles that will appear to the readership, and they're, maybe less concerned with, is that the strongest study design available? We did a study about novel cancer drugs. I went to a conference and somebody was saying this drug's a breakthrough, and somebody said this drug's a game changer. This is a miracle, and that's a cure. I was like, oh my goodness, that's really a lot of powerful language. What if you took those words and you searched over a period of time and asked, what were the news stories about all the game changers, miracles, breakthroughs, and cures? So we did that. We found 100 articles in a very short period of time, and we went through and said, what are the drugs that are being tested? And what we found was 50% of the drugs are not approved by the FDA. 14% were never even given to a human being. They've only been given to a mouse. I don't think you should do a news story about a drug that's only been given to the mouse and call it a breakthrough. We know that drugs that work in mice, they very infrequently work in human beings. In fact, I thought the probability of this, it would be like, in my mind, I was thinking of an analogy, and I was like, it would be like a news story when there was like a Powerball, going to find somebody who bought a ticket, and then like ask them about like, where are you going to put the swimming pool? What cars are you going to buy? But then in fact, there was a big Powerball, and they did do that. So then I thought, at least they're consistent. At least they're consistent. They'll talk about low probability events. Okay. All right. So what are the solutions? In the book that we wrote, we talked a little bit, and I think I'll wrap up pretty close, because I think you save some time for questions. So I think we talked a little bit about education, about regulation, about reimbursement. So I think we have a medical education system that for 2 years we teach students basic science. We teach them the pathophysiology of the body. When I have students come on the wards and I ask them, why am I giving this patient who just had a heart attack an ACE inhibitor? They say, well, ACE inhibitors prevent ventricular remodeling through the TGF-beta pathway. I was like, no. I'm giving it to this patient because randomized studies have shown overall mortality benefit. That's why I'm giving it. Now, why does it show an overall mortality benefit? Maybe that has something to do with that story you were singing. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. But that's the reason I'm doing it, is for the data. But we prioritize it wrong in their minds, so that when students someday come to those points in medicine where we don't have data, I don't think they think about it the way epidemiologists think about a question. They think about it the way pathophysiologists think about a question, which is, how can I fix what's broken? The way a mechanic might think about it. But I think the human body and our understanding of the human body is nothing near what a mechanic understands. Our understanding of even cancer cells, despite popular narratives that we're about to understand everything, our understanding is so fragmented. It's just the tip of the understanding. We barely understand the genetic alteration. We know that there are alterations. The cancer's genome looks like a shattered dinner plate. But what does all that mean, and what's working, and what's responsible? We have no idea. And I think people who pretend otherwise are kidding themselves. Regulation. Well, unfortunately, we are in a bad time for this. I think we have an FDA that, at least in oncology drug products, that really approves things very rapidly on very minimal efficacy data. And I think many of us believe that it would be better if they would raise the bar. That if we had a policy that we won't approve drugs that improve survival 10 days, and we won't approve drugs that shrink cancers. We don't know if it makes you live longer or better. I think we would encourage the industry to pursue better drugs. But in fact, the 21st Century Cures and the current proposed nominees to the FDA commissionership, they probably feel otherwise. Reimbursement. I mean, we have a model where we pay doctors for what they do, number of procedures. That is not a good model in terms of if you want somebody to give you, no matter what we say today, for the time being at least, there'll be many medical decisions where we're operating in the gray zone. That's the reality of medicine. You have to make decisions in the gray zone, even with the best evidence. And when you make decisions in the gray zone, I think you want the person who helps you through that decision to be as impartial as possible. You don't want them to have financial ties to the drug makers. You don't want them to think that if I make a decision one way, I'm more likely to get grants. You don't want them to get paid for making one decision over the other. I think that's just a reasonable policy. It's a policy we have for judges, but it's not the policy we have in medicine. I think we have to ask ourselves honestly, how much of what we pay for and pay tremendously for doesn't help our patients? We're at healthcare is 20% of GDP. Will it be 30% of GDP, 40%, 50%? At what point of GDP will we have to ask, how much can you pay for this without knowing how much of it actually helps? And I think we have to elucidate that. We have a randomized trial agenda that is highly skewed towards testing very trivial hypotheses and not testing real questions that you have when you go to the hospital and practice. But I think an easy fix is it's hard to take stuff you're doing and really throw things out very quickly. People will, get very angry about that. But it's easy to have a strong barrier for novel things to come to market. New costly technology that's being introduced to health systems, they're ideal for testing in randomized trials. And they're ideal, especially if they've been tested in dubious trials with unrepresented populations. How would I cover a drug like Entresto, the Novartis drug I showed you? I would say it should only be covered in a randomized study, a pragmatically done randomized study. And then we'll see if it works. The drug company wants it only to be covered in a registry where they'll compare it to historical controls. And then I think they're going to get what they want, which is a positive outcome. I think we have to be careful about studying interventions from before and after studies. And I think, paying for drugs based on outcomes data is prone to this. I'll skip that cost effectiveness. I want to just show this and say, people say that it's incredibly expensive to do pragmatic randomized controlled trials. They did a randomized trial in the Netherlands of one intervention. For people who had a heart attack, we randomly allocated them to sucking out the clot in the coronary artery or not sucking it out. That's called the TASTE trial. And this trial, in the blue graph, it shows you all of the patients who presented with a heart attack over time, and then the red shows all of the people who were randomized in the study. You see, we're randomizing upwards of 60% of the people in the Netherlands who are coming in with a heart attack. This is fantastic. We don't get this kind of trial recruitment in the United States. How much did it cost them to do this randomized trial? $50 a person. In our country, we're talking about $20,000 per person to do a randomized study. How do they have it to $50? They've built an observational registry. That's already built into that. They put this into the workflow. It had very simple to enroll patients in this study. They brought the cost down. I think the solution to healthcare, if you bring the cost to do a randomized study down to $50, you can answer a lot of questions. Okay, so I'll give to one objection, because this will always come up. What about randomized trials of parachutes? You say, here's another person who says that we need more randomized trials in medicine. But you know what? I'd like to say you can't have a randomized trial for everything, because you know what? There's no randomized trial of the parachute. In fact, these authors humorously wrote in the British Medical Journal that after a systematic review, they can find no randomized study of a parachute. They have found case reports that people without a parachute have survived. And they say, we think everyone will benefit if the most radical protagonists of evidence-based medicine organized and participated in a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled crossover trial of the parachute. Okay, so I think it's funny, and I think people, and actually, I don't want to tell you what I'm working on, but we're doing something related to this. People talk about this a lot. Okay, but there's two huge limits between this analogy and medicine. Here's one. When you get thrown out of a plane, there is one pathophysiology of what's about to happen. There's no question. There's no alternative signaling pathway. There's no some other redundancy. You are falling out of the plane. You're gonna hit splat. And the parachute's gonna slow that, okay? It's very rare in medicine that we actually understand pathophysiology so well that there's a single clear etiology. There may be sometimes trauma. I don't think any of us who've been proponents for randomized trials have said that if you were walking down the street and a car hit you and your leg was shattered and sticking out of your leg, the orthopedic surgeon shouldn't go in there, screw it together, and sew you up. I think we all accept that there's some things you're not going to do a randomized trial of. Let the leg stick out or let the leg go back inside. I think there's some things that we think we understand the pathophysiology, but that's not the case in cancer drugs, where we rarely understand it. Maybe there's one example, BCR-ABL. It's not the case with blood pressure, where it's incredibly multifactorial and complex. The other thing is, look at the effect size here. If you fall out of a plane without a parachute, there are a handful of case reports of someone surviving. Most people will die. If you jump out of a plane with a parachute, we looked up the statistics, 1 out of every 10 to the 6th or 10 to the 7th people will die from the parachute getting tangled. So you're improving survival from like 0.00001 to 99.99999. That's an effect size that just doesn't exist in medicine. I'm sorry, there's nothing we do with that effect size. Even the best things we do don't have that effect size, taking you from a fraction of 1% to well over 99%. And John and Tiago Pereira, they have that great paper in JAMA called Very Large Treatment Effects, or Empirical Investigation of Very Large Treatment Effects, where they look through all of Cochrane and they show that there's only one intervention with even an odds ratio of 5 in terms of mortality, and that's extracorporeal oxygenation for neonates. So, there's empirical data that says that very few things or nothing has that treatment effect. The other thing is, when I used to do this research, I had some great articles where people said that appendectomy for appendicitis was a parachute. And people said there will never be a randomized trial of that. That wasn't that long ago, just about 10 years ago. Now we have 4 randomized trials of appendectomy versus high-dose antibiotics. And what do they show? Appendectomy is still probably better, but there's 86% of people who just take antibiotics who don't need an appendectomy. We are probably going to be able to refine some treatment score to say these are people with low enough risk that they don't benefit from appendectomy. So this was something that was hailed as a parachute. That was no such thing. Oh, there's a John paper. Anyway, I talked about it. But that said, I do think there are some things in medicine that have been accepted without a randomized trial, and that's okay. Paul Glasziou made a list: insulin for diabetes, vitamin C for scurvy. You don't need a randomized trial for that. But I think the reality is that we do, hundreds of thousands of things in medicine, and the list is something like 300 long. It's a fraction of what we do. The not having randomized trials is really the exception of medical practice. It shouldn't be the rule. All right, so my final thoughts are, in terms of what will evidence-based medicine look like going forward, I think we need to move from a model where the conflicted parties design, conduct, and set the agenda to one where the clinical question is designed and conducted impartially. I think we'll see continued erosion of practices that gain prominence in the era of eminence-based medicine, including cancer screening, which I didn't talk about here. I think we have to discourage sensationalistic claims in preclinical, epidemiological, and observational work. I think we'll have to maybe defund some duplicative, low-yield, or uncertain research. I think we should probably put peer review to some sort of empirical testing, but there's been talk of that. And I think the ultimate take-home point I have is that history has taught us that the arc of medicine bends towards higher standards of evidence. And I think it will continue to do so, although we may be in a period of a setback now. But I think somebody once asked me recently, what has been the greatest technological advance of the 20th century? And my answer was the randomized controlled trial. And I think that really was the technology, and we should think of it as a technology. It's an innovation. It's an innovation to control for unmeasured confounders. It's a very powerful innovation. It's the best innovation. It's better than statins. And it's allowed us to separate things that don't work, that people believe work, from things that actually do work. And I think we need more of that, not less. So I'd just like to thank Adam Sifu, with whom I wrote the book. John, we've worked on a bunch of papers over the years. These are all the people who did the hard work of collecting all the data I showed you, including one of the current PhD students who I didn't show the paper we wrote, but Usama Bilal, who's, borderline genius, I think. This is a smart guy, like a lot of the students here, actually. But I wanted to say that the purpose of my talk, I always say this at the end because of what usually follows after I finish the talk, but I always say the purpose of this talk, just to remind the audience, is not to litigate any specific or particular medical practice, but to talk about broad patterns of medical progress and missteps. And the reason I say that is that some people really like stenting for renal artery stenosis or whatever, one of the examples I gave, and they just want to talk about all that but that's not the point. I mean, even if you were to say, okay, that's a good one, I'll give you credit for that. I have, hundreds of examples in the book. The percentages aren't going to change much, even if I gave you a dozen examples. That's not the point. The point is, I think we all recognize some things we do don't work. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned, first of all, great talk.
Oh, thank you.
So you mentioned about a lot of our trials are answering trivial questions.
Trivial question.
Do you see that as so we have many trials are sponsored by NIH.
Yeah.
Right? So presumably they go through a study section, and that should be addressed there. But and then there's the whole drug approval process where the FDA is sort of weighing in about study design and that kind of thing. So where do you see a difference between NIH versus FDA trials? What role do these bodies, so the NIH funding trials and the FDA, play in sort of reducing those sort of trivial questions that are being answered by ours?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will say that, and we all know there's triviality and then there's really trivial. And we all know of what we call seeding trials that are really, really bad. And the real purpose of doing the trial is so that some company can pass out reprints at a doctor's office and get him to use a drug off-label or get him to use a drug in a population it's not supposed to. I would say the NIH and the FDA are forces of good in the world, and they tend to push for impartiality and tend to push for better trial design. And I would say that I think some of us are critical of the fact they haven't pushed hard enough. And I'll tell you a couple of reasons why. So in oncology, I think the bulk of our clinical trials are run through NIH-sponsored cooperative groups. And the reality of the NIH-sponsored cooperative group, and we published a paper in the New England Journal on this topic, is that if I'm doing an oncology trial and I want to study a novel drug, and in our paper we said that here are 5 novel drugs that they're next-in-class drugs. They're Me Too drugs to older drugs. The older drug was never approved for that indication, only the novel drug was, because the industry did a mega study. If I want to do a comparative effectiveness study, non-inferiority, old drug versus novel drug, and I'm the NIH cooperative group, what will it cost to do that study? And all we did was calculate what is the drug cost to acquire the novel drug. And the answer was it was $30 to $90 million for very small, for 500 to 1,000 person randomized trials. And so the reality of cooperative groups is, in oncology at least, to do the trials we want to do, they have to get partnership from the industry. Roche has to donate the drug, Johnson & Johnson. And that is, I think, a limit on their ability to ask very provocative questions, at least in oncology. And I can't speak to other fields because I just don't know the trials that well, at least not anymore.
So you're saying NIH is funding these oncology cooperative groups?
Yeah. And then they have to partner with the industry.
And so
Yeah.
it seems like there's
a big conflict. Yeah. And the industry will push, and I think they'll push to try to get the best trial design they can. And then with the FDA, I think the reality is, the purpose of the drug company's interaction with the FDA is to get the FDA to commit, before they launch the trial, what is the shortest, quickest, most surrogate trial you will take before you approve this drug. And then what we see is sometimes they do that and they get approval. Sometimes they fail to do what the FDA says, and they still go seeking approval, as we saw with Sarpetra, with the Duchenne's muscular dystrophy drug, where the FDA said do a randomized trial. They said, here's 11 patients we gave the drug to. Here's their change in dystrophin. It was unblinded, unblinded surrogate measure. FDA said when we had our blinded people look at the dystrophin on Western blot, there was, almost no change in dystrophin. And then here's a couple anecdotes. Here's a lot of money for patient advocacy groups to go to the meeting and make you feel very nervous about what if you reject the drug. So I think, the industry's pushing so hard the other way. I feel like even though they're forces for good, I wish they were, the pendulum would swing a lot more and they'd really push for strong study design. So I guess I'm pessimistic, and especially with the way current legislation has, the Cures Act it's not signed by the president yet, but it will be, unfortunately. And I think it's just going to make the bar even lower, as if it weren't low enough. Yeah. Yeah.
Undermining FDA clinical trial standards is part of how recent years. Also, the failure to actually support comparative effectiveness trials, the likely challenges to actually the CORI and CMMI funding. And I'm wondering the big ally to the industry is with patient groups, many funded by industry, that are asking how can we persuade them that better evidence and not just faster access is out there. It's the best solution.
Oh, thank you. Oh, what a good question. So I would say I agree with everything you said. And I would say that I think the reason the Cures bill sails through without sort of more public outrage is the things that are good about the bill are so easy to understand. More money for science. Easy. That's a bumper sticker. The things that are insidious about that bill are very technical to understand. Why shouldn't real-world data, isn't that better than non-real? Well, who wants non-real-world data leading to approval of drugs? What they don't tell you is, the multiplicity of post-hoc mining EHR data will lead to, you can find any cancer drug because of confounding by indication and multiplicity, looking retrospectively, is going to work in some off-label indication. That's a very harder message to get across. So I would say that And you also know I've been quite critical of patient advocacy groups because they are, heavily industry funded. I think one of the ways to push back is they only voluntarily disclose their funding. Even the 990 forms I've looked through for these groups, they require them to list how much they've gotten, but not from whom. So I think we need more transparency. Now we have Sunshine Act, although if that's not overturned, but thank God for the time being we have Sunshine Act, so I can look up every doctor and find out who pays them how much. And that's half the data we're using right now for studies. But if we had some sort of act for patient advocacy groups to see who pays them how much, and at some point, if it's over, 75% or 80% of their funding is the industry, I think they should legally have to call themselves industry advocacy groups that also have a few patients in it. Something like that. I mean, they shouldn't be allowed to use that title. And I think you're right. Convincing the public that better evidence is better for them in the long run is the challenge. And I don't know the best way to do that in terms of a messaging standpoint. I mean, I think that, there are lots of us who do it. We're all kind of fragmented. We have to kind of have a similar message. We have to keep it very simple, push the public to understand that it's the evidence that matters. There's been a lot of movements in that. And now we do randomized trials in education, early education. The public's starting to see that, you can bring data into policy questions. But I think that's the crux of the issue, to convince the public that, I think I like to think in cancer drugs, they have this idea that the FDA is blocking. I think that's the industry has promoted that message. The FDA is blocking these great drugs that are just behind the door. But the FDA is allowing all of these drugs through so that 71 consecutive drugs, their median improvement in survival is 2.1 months. The bar is so low. Those are the drugs they're letting in. The ones they're blocking are so crappy, marginal, toxic, and harmful that they don't even meet that mediocre bar. You don't want to lower that bar, It's okay to block a couple of those crappy drugs. How crappy is it before they say no? I don't know, but I think you're right. That's the right message. We have to go. Okay. Thank you.
So much.